أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Welcome to The Struggle Within, our weekly akhlaq-based show, as we've highlighted at the beginning of every episode, that is inspired by the tradition relating back to the Prophet and his companions when they were returning back from battle and they were congratulating one another on having partaken in the Jihad, where the Prophet then said to them, prepare yourselves now for the greater Jihad. After which they asked, what is this greater Jihad? Where he replied that this is the greater Jihad of the nafs, the struggle within. As highlighted previously, we've touched on various different topics looking at what Jihad is and the various pitfalls one must keep in mind when embarking on this struggle within. This week I'm delighted to be joined by a sister, Amina Inlos. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you very much for taking the time. This week we wish to discuss one of the things that we must keep in mind embarking upon this is the trials and tribulations that one encounters in their daily life. We have a hadith here from the 6th Holy Imam, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, where he says, verily it is mentioned in the book of Ali that of all mankind the prophets undergo the severest of trials, and after them the awsiya, and after the elect to the extent of their nobility. Indeed, the believer undergoes trial in proportion to his good deeds. So one whose faith is sound and whose deeds are good, his trials are also more severe. This is indeed because God Almighty did not make this world a place for rewarding the believer and punishing the unbeliever. And one whose faith is feeble and whose good deeds are few faces fewer tribulations. Verily tribulations hasten towards the believer with greater speed than rainwater towards the earth's depths. Quite a long tradition, but a very vivid, describing very candidly this idea that an individual who's closer to God, who has more good deeds, will face more trials and tribulations. If we can begin just elaborating on this idea of trials and tribulations, and what is in fact the wisdom behind this. What is Allah trying to do when putting His servants through these trials and tribulations?
Indeed. Is this not backwards? Shouldn't it be the opposite, that the mu'min should be blessed, apparently, on the surface of things with ease and luxury and a good life, and the kafir, the person who ardently fights against Allah, who fights against God and against all that is good, should not this person live a very difficult and miserable life? Why would they be having palaces and luxuries like Fir'aun and other people throughout history? Well, I guess this is the question we're going to be dissecting for the next segment, inshaAllah. The narration which you very kindly read to us is very strongly reinforced by a number of other ahadith, particularly from Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, as well as the book of Allah Ta'ala. I think we can say that this philosophy of Allah trying people, and in particular trying the prophets and the believers with the most difficult trials, is, one can say, it's an essential aspect of our faith. It is something which is very well established. Now, why this is, of course, there are any number of reasons. On a very basic level, it goes back to the basic purpose of our life. Allah Ta'ala mentions in the Holy Quran, He speaks of Himself, He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. Most of us are familiar with that ayah. It says that Allah Ta'ala has created death and life to see which of us is the best in deeds. Now obviously Allah, the infinitely wise, does not need to see, literally, or to know, or to understand which one of us is the best in our deeds. He is able to test us and weigh us before we come into this world, but for us at least to have some understanding of that. After all, would you accept it? Not as if we have any right to argue against God, but nonetheless, would you accept it if you go to the next world and well, I don't want to say you, because this might hurt your feelings. Would someone accept it if they go to the next world and they haven't done anything wrong in this life, and Allah says, well, you're going to go to hell because I know you have the capacity to go to hell, and you would have done things that make you go to hell. No one would accept that. They'd say, well, I didn't do anything wrong. So Allah Ta'ala puts us through tests in this life on a very basic level to weigh us in the akhirah. So we have no argument against Allah. If Amina, am sent to hell, I fully acknowledge it's because of things I have done with my own hands, and if I'm in heaven, it's by Allah's mercy. That's a very basic answer. Additionally, going through these challenges that Allah Ta'ala gives us helps us to understand and to develop our own capacity. If you live a life of luxury and a life of ease, and you never go through any sort of challenges in life, you might not even know your own strengths and your own potential. After all, it is in times of difficulty when we understand what we are able to bear, and we are able to develop ourselves. And although living a life of luxury is not a guarantee, I don't want to veer too far off topic, but recently I saw some videos of some princesses in Saudi Arabia discussing being in a difficult life situation. Now, I'm not qualified to comment on the situation in the videos, but what was striking to me was a recurring message, which is even though we are princesses and we come from this very wealthy family, it doesn't mean that we aren't suffering, and people just assume because we come from this background that our lives are very easy. So you never know what people are going through. However, if there is someone, they come from, say, a very wealthy background, a very privileged background, everyone's always praising them, the red carpet comes out, you don't usually expect that person to have a lot of very deep wisdom about the world, a lot of humility, sometimes a lot of maturity, for example. It is going through these difficulties that does make us into who we are. And so we see that one of the things that also recurs in our narrations is that Allah Ta'ala grants us these trials as a gift. So even though they are not enjoyable by nature, bala, which is the subject of the narration, is something which is difficult, nonetheless they are for our own good, even in this world, and even with respect to our personal development.
So ultimately it's the idea of being trialed or being tested to reveal what we have within us, to open up more character, to see what we can endure with regards to these various different tests, to see how we come about on the other end. Would that be a general summing up of a very sort of introductory sort of look at this idea?
Indeed, one of the metaphors that comes up again in a hadith, for example, from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, is the purification of gold. For instance, it's narrated that you, mu'mineen, or perhaps even the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, will be purified in the same way that gold is purified. And how is gold purified? It's by, traditionally it's by the fire, by melting it, by breaking it down. Fire, of course, is painful, it's difficult, but out of it emerges the pure gold. Another metaphor that comes up in our narrations is, and oftentimes parallel to this, is the concept of being sifted. So through trials we are sifted, like if you have, flour. Do you bake cakes?
No.
You don't bake
I like
cakes?
eating cake.
Okay, well if you're going to bake a cake, traditionally people would sift the flour, so they'd take out the big pieces and you'd only have the very fine grains of flour remaining. So it's the same thing. Allah sifts people through trials, and one of the contexts this is mentioned in is with respect to the return of the Imam, may Allah hasten his return, to sift out who will be his closest followers.
Okay, because, as the tradition says, verily tribulations, or trials shall we say, hasten towards the believer with greater speed than rainwater towards the earth's depth. So it's constant, you can imagine, especially if, for example, if you were tried and you came out better for it on the other end, then expect more trials. We'll look at that in coming later on in the show, but one of the things that comes to light when you read this tradition, at the beginning, it highlights that the prophets and the A'immah were the ones who faced the greatest trials. So if trials are there to sift through who is the purest, if we take the metaphor of gold, then why is it that you have the prophets who have come here arguably not to be tried, but have come here to give us a message to understand these trials, or to understand what our purpose is? Why is it that they are being tried? Likewise with the A'imma. And the other question following upon that is that if we have this understanding that the A'imma, the prophets, were infallible, then why try them if they're already infallible? If they can't make a mistake, then why try them?
That is a very good point. Yes, again, on a very basic level, this explanation does not extend to the prophets and their successors, peace be upon all of them, because, as you mentioned, we do believe they are ma'soom, and so they don't need to be refined in the same way that we need to be. Or one of the things, which maybe we can talk about later, is it's narrated that for us lesser people, we are sometimes given difficulties as punishment for our sins, either in order to bring us back to Allah, sort of like you might punish a child for doing something wrong that's harmful for themselves, or so that we don't have to be punished in the next world. Although the narration that you read at the beginning made it very clear that this world is not the place of punishing or rewarding, and the hadith don't say that, but just in some cases Allah will do this out of His mercy to try to bring people back to the right path, or else so that we're not liable for punishment in the akhirah. We can just go, inshallah, straight to Jannah, inshallah. So with respect to the prophets and the awsiya, and the imams, peace be upon them, among the things that are mentioned about this, one of them is that because of the greater or greatest spiritual capacity of the imams and the prophets, peace be upon them, they simply are pained more by things that occur, especially calamities that befall human beings around them, or people acting in a misguided and unjust manner. I'm going to be honest. Most people, now I'm not saying everyone, and inshallah many of the viewers are not like this, but most people do have a limited capacity to care. If something happens to someone who's not in their racial group, their tribe, their religion, their country, halfway around the world, no relationship, many people will not feel that as strongly as something that, say, happens to a family member or someone living in the same city. It's just human nature. However, the prophets and the imams, the ma'sumin, peace be upon them, were on such a high level that they would be the most deeply distressed by injustice, by wrongdoing, also polytheism, and so forth. So because of this compassion, and of course, we know the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa sallam is rahmatan lil alameen, and this sensitivity to the human condition, they would be liable to be distressed more over any sort of calamity or trial which is affecting the people at large, and also being sensitive to things such as polytheism. For example, Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. Let's imagine it's a long, long time ago, and I was born in the time of Nabi Ibrahim, peace be upon him. And let's say the people around me are polytheists. Let's say I was aware enough to know this is wrong. I would probably be disturbed, but to be fully honest, probably not as disturbed as Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, because he's got this much higher spiritual status. I mean, I see so many wrong things in society here. I feel disturbed, but not to the level that a prophet or imam would. So because of this higher capacity, they will innately suffer more. Another thing to keep in mind is that, as is said, the sins of the prophets are different from my sins. Inshallah, not your sins, but my sins. That is to say, a sin for me, for example, might be, God forbid, lying, stealing, these things, snacking in the month of Ramadan. Just kidding. But for the prophets, obviously, they don't do these things. So sin for them is to diverge from the continuous remembrance of Allah Ta'ala. And this is mentioned in a number of ways in our texts. For example, it's related, this is from Imam Rida alayhi salam, it's related that Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam was once speaking to Allah from his heart. He says, "Ya Allah, why is it that I had to stay in prison for such a long time?" because we know he said, to Allah, prison is better for me than what these people are calling me to do, the wrongdoing. And Allah reprimands him a bit and said, well, you said prison is better for me. Why didn't you say safety is better for me? Are you limiting the capacity of Allah to grant anything? So because of that, Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam lingered in the prison a bit longer. So because they have this much higher standard, so to speak, then if they are at all diverted from the inner remembrance of Allah, or even if it's just not at that pinnacle of remembrance of Allah, then they might be given a difficulty to move them back to it, so to speak. And another thing to keep in mind is that in Islam we have the concept that the leaders are the ones who should give the most. For example, Al-Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Why is it that he is so loved and so revered? Is it for the things that happened, say, in the first 50 years of his life? I mean, he was still the same Al-Imam al-Hussein, the same person, same faith, same piety, same service, but mostly we remember him for what he went through and what he gave. So this is an expectation. And with respect to being ma'soom, how would we really know the prophets and imams were ma'soom if they didn't go through these types of difficulties? If someone's living a very easy life, it's very easy to appear pious and to appear perfect, but it's when you see someone who's really put to the test, then you understand who they are. Now I must apologize. I cut you off and that was terribly rude of me.
So in that sense, what you're trying to highlight is the idea that they will also be tested and tried. In difficulty, you'll see them, literally they are suffering in that sense, but the idea here is that we can then look at them as practical examples. So it's not necessarily an example where the Imam narrates traditions or through his speech that we get the example, but rather through action. So through, for example, the seventh Imam being imprisoned or tortured, etc., etc., and going through those kind of trials and tribulations, do we see when he comes back out and he's still as firm, the idea that, this is a practical role model, that when I'm going through my trials and tribulations, this is an individual that I can point to and say, this is what I need to, or this is my leader, this is what I need to aspire to. Is that part of the wisdom in that sense for the trials for the A'immah in that sense?
Definitely. Of course, actions do speak louder than words. If we didn't have these practical examples, probably it would be much more difficult for many people to follow the prophets in general and the Imams, peace be upon them. In fact, from Imam al-Qadhim alayhi salam, it's narrated that with respect to the difficulties that we go through, going through difficulty in a time of affliction is better for the believer than going through oblivion in a time of ease. And that one of the things that's also mentioned in our narrations is that going through difficulties reminds us of Allah Ta'ala, brings us closer to Allah, brings us back to Allah. Sometimes we get negligent when everything is going right. And if you think about this narration is not coming from anyone. It's coming from the Imam who arguably, on a quantitative scale, is said to have undergone the most years of pure torture and suffering, imprisonment. So he's someone who is speaking about what he has experienced in this life firsthand. And I think that's something which is also extremely powerful. One thing we can keep in mind too is that while the prophets and the imams, peace be upon them, Hazrat Fatima, peace be upon her, are at the highest status, nonetheless, because Allah is infinite, it's always possible for them to increase their position more before Allah Ta'ala. For example, this is why we say salawat. Obviously the Prophet, he doesn't need our salawat. Ahlul Bayt, they don't need our salawat. They don't need the angels to do salawat on them. They already have that absolutely close position with Allah Ta'ala. I mean, we even have narrations saying that they taught the angels themselves how to worship. So they don't need that. But because, again, Allah is infinite, they can always increase in position before Allah Ta'ala, while at the same time that doesn't affect their superiority over creation. For example, one area this is mentioned is in the account of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, when he's about to leave the holy city of Medina. It's related that he went to visit the resting place of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. and he has a dream that he sees the Prophet, and the Prophet is saying that we are waiting for you in heaven, we want to see you, that your position in paradise, Ya Abu Abdullah, is so high that the only way you can have this position is through martyrdom in this world. So it's not that the Imam had a lesser status, but there's always that infinite potential. So perhaps that's part of the wisdom behind this too. Allahu A'lam.
So in that sense, one can also gather the idea that while they're there as infallibles, as examples for us to follow, they too are also being tested in some way, or they're going through some trial where they themselves can elevate in status. Would that be correct to say, or?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that there's no sense in testing someone beyond their capacity. Now let's say someone has a very limited spiritual capacity. Let's say they're very animalistic in nature. They're just interested in their food and entertainment, and so they're not a very spiritually developed person. There's no point in giving them this gigantic trial from Allah. Now I'm not getting into things that people are responsible for themselves, because as the saying goes, people do dig their own grave all the time. That there's no sense for Allah as the divine power to give this person a spiritual test that they can't handle. It makes more sense to give them something a bit lesser to help them develop. But for someone who's already at the height of their spiritual development, who has a very developed spiritual capacity, then they do have the ability to take on something more. The analogy that gets used so often is weightlifting. The novice is going to start out with the little weights, but someone who's an Olympic athlete doesn't really need that, or doesn't need to be limited by that. They're able to demonstrate and develop through more.
We'll touch upon this because, coming back to your introduction when you highlighted that what is the point, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already knows, so what is the point? But one thing that I want to look at, and this isn't necessarily when it comes to our own struggle within, when we're looking for role models and inspiration from the A'imma, the question of infallibility always does come up. The idea that, well, if they're infallible, then they're not exactly role models for me. I need to aspire, or I can only aspire to individuals who also were tested the way I'm tested, or who had the inclinations that I have, and therefore can relate with them. So this idea of infallibility, is there a misunderstanding here with regards to how they were tested, in that it wasn't just plain sailing, they were tested and they made choices, they had different opportunities, they had their own trials, and they were therefore tested. So it wasn't necessarily that they were robots that couldn't do wrong. Would that be correct in saying? I mean, ideally what I'm trying to look for here is, this is a slight tangent, but just a description, shall we say, of what infallibility is, so that we can look at that and maybe aspire to that even. Because I've read previously in my research for this idea of infallibility, that this is obviously, number one, this is granted through the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and number two, this is something that we can also attain, where we may be able to be infallible in certain areas, maybe not in all areas. Now, for example, alcohol. We are repelled by alcohol in a way that some may argue, or some may describe it as, we're infallible from this trait, that we will run the mile. We will have, close friends, but if they're sat on a table with alcohol, we'll stay away. I can genuinely say that, but there may be other sins where, I step over and I cross the line, and I'm like, well, I'm not really hurting one, or this is a grey area, or my temptations overtake me. So is this idea of infallibility something that is gained when it comes to the A'imma? Was it something earned? Is it earned the way we earn it? Or is this something that, they were given it and they were infallible, and yes, they were tried, but they couldn't do any wrong, and that's the end of it?
Those are some very important issues, which I do agree are very pertinent to a lot of people. A lot of people do bring up these questions. With respect to the infallibility of the prophets and the imams, peace be upon all of them, you can see there's two aspects, at least, that are identified. One is, as you mentioned, this sense of revulsion from certain sins. All of us who have any sort of functioning ethical mechanism inside ourselves, and it doesn't matter what faith you happen to practice, if any, we are naturally repelled by certain wrong deeds. You mentioned many Muslims, and even some others, are repelled by alcohol. And so you don't have any inclination to drink. In fact, if someone gave you alcohol, you would want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And for many of us, there are deeds that we see that they are ugly. Lying, for example. It's very hard to find a person who thinks lying is wonderful and beautiful and they love it, especially if the lying is happening about us, incidentally. We feel a sense of distaste and dislike for that. That's innate in the human being. So we are able to perceive the reality of some sins according to our level of spiritual insight. People like the prophets and the imams, the Ma'asumin, peace be upon them, were at such a high spiritual level that it's said that, it's narrated, that they perceived the ugliness of all sins. So for example, no one would eat dryer lint. That's a nicer example than some of the examples given. The lint that comes off of your clothes, because you'd say, why? That's disgusting. I'm not going to eat that. So in the same way, that's how they see certain sins which might come across as pleasurable to other people. So because they see the reality of disobeying Allah and doing certain wrong things, they don't have an inclination to do it. And that comes from spiritual insight and basira, and as you rightly mentioned, that is something we can share in to some degree, and most of us do. I mean, there are, I'm sure for everyone, certain acts that we are just repelled by and we would never do in a million years. Of course, it's always good to seek the protection of Allah. People do change, they get tempted, there's peer pressure and so forth. But inshallah, may we remain on that path. And there are actually other forms of practical or partial infallibility, Asma, for ordinary people like me, which are mentioned in narrations. In addition to that, among them being simply the inability to commit a sin. So for example, if something is not accessible where you live, and maybe in the olden days you live in a mountain village somewhere, and I don't know, you didn't have certain haram things that are very easily accessible here today. In a sense, this protects you from the sin. Also, I would add, the more careful we are not to start a wrong thing, the more protected from it we will be. Because it's much easier to not start a bad habit in life, especially things that are addictive, than it is to give it up afterwards, as anyone will say. I don't think anyone ever regretted not getting into a bad habit or addictive substance or whatnot. But then with respect to the Ma'asumin, alayhimu salam, there is another aspect with respect to their infallibility, which is the divine blessing or grace that accompanies that. And the explanation I am favorable to is that this is not necessarily a linear matter, the way the human brain tends to perceive it, that Allah willed to create the Prophet, and he is the most ma'soom and the most perfect, and then he willed to create the imams, and then he willed to create the rest of us and just made us not ma'soom. And that's usually how we picture the creational process, because again, we are very limited by our experience in this life. But the explanation that I am favorable to is that because Allah has absolute knowledge of everything, the beginning, the end, everything in between, he's not in time like we are, he knew that the Prophet, peace be upon him, Hazrat Fatima and so forth, would be the most obedient, the closest to him, because he doesn't need to wait for everything to happen to know what will happen. And for that reason, he gave them the gift of Isma based on who they were. That's something that's alluded to actually in the ziyarat of Fatima Zahra, salamu alayha, where it says that Allah Ta'ala tested her before he created her and found her to be patient over what she would go through. And I think this is a just explanation, and it is a fair explanation. And of course, the reality that with this comes the greatest difficulty in the world too for them is also, I think, something which is just and fair, although difficult for them.
So it's the idea that, I mean, we have, for example, the verse in the Quran, I don't know the reference, but where we were all asked, "Am I not your Lord?" And, we all testified at that point. So there was a point before where we were asked, and a question is, you can elaborate that, a question is a test almost. So, for example, the ones that shouted yes the loudest, we all had the choice to, and they shouted yes the loudest, for example. This is a very, it's not a very deep kind of explanation, but arguably the ones who shouted the loudest ended up being the ones that wanted it the most, or that showed the testification to the oneness of God the most, arguably ended up being the ones who became the examples for us to follow. Obviously we can't, you know, we can only dabble in what was before. We can't really say with much certainty apart from what the Quran says itself. But I want to then touch on this idea that, you know, and this has come up previously, even when, you know, in our teens, when we were speaking amongst one another, that if God already knows, because you see, these kind of questions are so important in our self-development, that when we try to look within and try to embark on this journey, these questions do come up, where you try to understand what is it that's going on. So like infallibility, like this idea of looking for role models, this idea that, well, if God already knows, then what's the point? Surely there's something not quite right about that. So how do we explain this idea that, like you touched upon in your introduction, this idea that, well, if God already knows, then what's the point? Is there more to it than the idea that just so that we could see for ourselves?
Indeed. This is a very good question. Does Allah need us to be tried and tested? Does He gain anything from it? And of course, we know the answer is no. As He says in the Holy Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas antumul fuqara'u ila Allah wallahu huwal ghaniyyul hamid. We are the ones who are in need of Allah, and He is needless of all of us and praiseworthy. Does He need our worship? Does He need our prayer? Does He need our khums, our zakat, our fasting, our creation? I mean, could He simply get rid of humanity and the universe? And would that take away from Him? And the answer, of course, is no. This is an entrenched part of our belief. So I think when we discuss a question like this, with respect to why are the believers tried in this world, it is important to remember that ultimately this is for ourselves as human beings, and inshallah as mu'mineen and mu'minat as well. And that Allah does not benefit from it in the slightest, but rather it is for our benefit. This is narrated. Now that may seem a bit odd, because generally speaking, most people don't consider it to their benefit if they go through a serious illness, an accident, poverty, violence, whatever it happens to be. And of course there's an entire long list of things that people suffer from. But it is mentioned in narrations that in particular for the believers, these sorts of trials are gifts. For example, one narration, it's attributed, I think, to the Prophet ﷺ. It says that Allah feeds the believers with these tests and these trials in the same way that a mother feeds her infant milk. So with that amount of caring and that amount of giving. So in a sense, although these things are difficult for us, they are a mercy from Allah Ta'ala. Now, of course, one might ask, well, then how is that really helping us out? I mean, we've had some answers already. It helps to develop ourselves, for example. One of the things that is mentioned is that going through these difficulties, first of all, for the believers, it keeps us constantly mindful of Allah Ta'ala. You've probably come across a narration that says that if a believer goes for 40 days without having some severe difficulty or calamity or crisis that causes them to turn to Allah, then they should be afraid for their own faith. That Allah is not going to leave a believer alone, because He wants us to stay attached to Him. And let's be honest, when are the majority of people most prayerful, most humble before Allah, most in need. When we're begging Allah for help, is it when everything is going great and you're popular and, I don't know, CEO of the big company and etc.? No, it's not. It's during times when things are not going so great. And it also helps detach us from this world. After all, we, Bani Adam, we are created from earth, according to the Holy Quran, or clay. So it is said that because we are created from the earth, we have a natural attachment to things that are from the earth, whether it's land, material things, spouses, family, etc. And this is part of the human nature, but of course this is not our eternal place of living. It's just a temporary situation that we are in before we go on to the final home. And so in order to keep us from getting too embroiled in the worldly life and seeing beyond that, Allah Ta'ala will separate the believer from certain worldly pleasures or the things that we love a lot in the world or are very attached to, in order to move our attention to what comes next. And although this is difficult, of course, because the human being wants to be attached to certain things here, ultimately, again, it is for our own good and to help put things into perspective.
So if we can move on to, when we look at different types of trials, like you mentioned, there's a long list of different types of trials, but often trials and tribulations don't necessarily have to be the traditional ones which we imagine, famine, loss of life, or loss of a loved one. Rather, it can be, a trial or tribulation could be something where, apparently materialistically it's seen to be something positive. So for example, riches, fame, these kind of things, traditionally what people look for or try to chase in this dunya, they could be granted as trials to then see how you deal with those. So what's your take on that kind of a trial?
Well, Allah says in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ وَنَبْلُوكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً, that every soul will test death, and that we, reading the Divine, will test people with good and with difficulty, maybe what we might call evil, as a trial. So this is something that Allah Ta'ala says in the Holy Quran directly. That basically everything in life is a test, as you mentioned, whether it's things that are on the surface obviously very difficult. If someone gets cancer, for example, no one's going to say that's not difficult. It's obviously difficult. But also things that are commonly perceived as good or desirable. Having a wonderful spouse, having children, having a very good job, having money, political power, whatever it happens to be. I mean, again, you look at Fir'aun, he had more or less everything that one could want materially, and yet that was a test that he failed. So it is very healthy to have perspective in life and to look at things as, whether they are good, whether they are bad, in our view, as things that we are being tried by. Also, Allah Ta'ala says we are tried by other people as well, and ultimately to see how we will do with them. Will we come closer to Allah Ta'ala? And I think the fact that that ayah refers to death first helps to put everything in perspective, that the sense of everything in the world being a test is part of the nature of this short-term existence and preparation for what comes after. Now in the Holy Quran, there's also the phrase bala'un hasan, meaning a good calamity, so to speak. I mean, bala in general, which is the word used in the narration you read at the beginning, very kindly. It does typically mean hardships. Karbun wa bala, for example. It's not used for getting a gigantic sum of money, for example. But there's this concept of a good trial or a good calamity. For example, it's used with respect to the Battle of Badr, which we know the Muslims won, despite all odds. They were under attack by their enemies who were trying to wipe them out, and Allah helped them. And in this ayah it mentions that certain things happened through the permission of Allah Ta'ala, or the will of Allah, and so that Allah would test them with this good trial. So to see, for example, would they remain faithful? Would they remain obedient? Would they remain humble? Or would some of them become arrogant? Would some of them become disobedient? And we know, of course, that what happened at the Battle of Uhud is that some of them did indeed get a little bit overconfident and then disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ. So it was, in fact, a trial for the believers that they were victorious and that they were successful. And among the things that the Holy Quran specifically emphasizes are trials, or fitna, are one's spouse and one's children. Yes, indeed. إِنَّمَا أَمْوَالُكُمْ وَأَوْلَادُكُمْ فِتْنَةٌ. And of course, a trial or a test can go one of two ways. It's a bit like taking an exam. Maybe some of you have A-level exams around now, for example. You can either pass and do very well, and it can increase your capacity in life, or you can do not so well, God forbid, and fail. So for example, raising a righteous child or having a healthy marriage can bring someone closer to Allah Ta'ala and offer a lot of thawab. But at the same time, these things can also lead people the wrong way if they put them above Allah Ta'ala, above what is right, and it's detrimental to their faith. So Allah warns us throughout the Holy Quran not to get too caught up in these things in the life of this world, because again, it's not so much what we have or who we have or where we are, but it's what we do with it that is important in the scheme of things.
One of the things that I wanted to look at was the idea of, taking lesson. So, the Quran is full of stories of individuals, like you mentioned Pharaoh a couple of times, who had everything and who ended up unsuccessful. Likewise, we don't have to look far to see people who are also being tried in their day-to-day. It could be someone who is going through a difficult time with whatever scenario. It could be family, it could be work, it could be anything. What is, or is there any advice from the A'imma to suggest that we take a closer look, or we keep our eyes peeled, look at trials and tribulations of other people, to brace ourselves for when those trials come to us? What are your thoughts on that?
Of course, even just within the Holy Quran, we're advised, for example, to look at those civilizations that came before us in ancient, sometimes ended up throwing themselves into destruction. I think there's two ways we can take this question, with your permission. Yes, of course, spiritually, we can learn a lot from other people. Sometimes we do see someone who's being tried with good things, doesn't arrogate people. Look at that and we say, God forbid that we become like that. As the hadith says, we learn our akhlaq also from people's wrong behavior. Also, there is another thing that is important to keep in mind in any discussion like this, and I do always like to bring it in, and that is a reminder that while Allah Ta'ala has promised to grant us tests, there is also the aspect of self-responsibility. And there are any number of difficulties which we bring upon ourselves. And it can be anything. Sometimes people are responsible for their family problems, their marital problems, even their health problems. People do things to lose their health, work problems, school problems, etc. I mean, there are things that we aren't responsible for that genuinely come from outside. There are things that we bring on ourselves individually. And there's also things that societies bring upon themselves. I mean, for example, in a society which has a lot of injustice in terms of poverty versus wealth, or lack of access to education and so forth, there's going to be certain social problems which are a natural consequence of what people themselves have done. And to solve them does not only involve asking the help of Allah Ta'ala, although we should always do that, but also involves taking responsibility for ourselves and our societies and saying, well, Allah has given us free will and intellect and the capacity to make a change, so we need to work for this. I'm actually in the camp that I think it's good to take self-responsibility, even though we are not genuinely responsible for everything. In part because this helps to avoid a sort of victim mentality. That is, you do find the occasional person who's basically on the other side of the spectrum, and everything that happens, they feel Allah is trying them, or Allah is giving them patience and so forth. And sometimes you do, with all respect, look at some of the decisions they've made in life, and you do feel that it's not only Allah who is responsible. For example, they're not doing the things they need in order to provide for themselves or their family. I'm not saying it's everyone, but I'm sure we all know people like this who make a series of bad decisions in life and then reap the consequences. And that's also very valuable to learn from too. Because if we are blessed with the ability to recognize basically how other people are messing up, well, we feel bad for them and we hope that they can get their lives together. At least we or the people around us, inshallah, can learn from that so as not to replicate that. And so I think, if anything, it is healthy to have this sense of self-responsibility. And we look at, for example, the great Shi'i, Sunni, even they don't feel Muslim, the great thinkers and reformers of the 20th century, past century. Were they people who just said, yes, these are and Allah, people who were genuinely influential? They said, yes, Allah tries us, Allah tests us, but we have power in the world, even if the power is very limited. I mean, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of Shi'i parts of the world were extremely marginalized. They said, what can we do to change things? And in the end, if it is genuinely a test from Allah, you will not necessarily be able to change it, or maybe Allah is waiting for you to change it, but they took responsibility for themselves and for the situation. And so I think this is one of the best things we can learn as well.
Awesome. We're coming to the end of the show. One thing that I wanted to look at was, I wanted to bridge the last points that I wanted to look at was, firstly, what advice do you have, or what advice is there from the A'imma for individuals who are going through trials and tribulations? And are there any specific du'as or a'mal that have been highlighted in helping one deal with such situations?
Yeah, of course, we have innumerable du'as and amal for times of distress and difficulty. There are ones that are well known, there are ones that are obscure. I think anything that anyone does with hope of the mercy of Allah, and of course, something reasonable, not something haram, of course, but a good act or a prayer or a means of approaching Allah or seeking intercession before Allah, that's done to try to call down Allah's mercy upon themselves, inshallah, it's something good. Of course, we do have any number of formal du'as. I think the du'as in Sahifat al-Sajadiyah, in my view, I think they are some of the most powerful du'as for times of distress. Also, it's a very authentic book as well, so that helps. And there are du'as for a number of situations, and I've definitely seen responses to these du'as. Not that Allah will be more responsive to one du'a than another, but there are definitely things that touch your heart when you are reading them. Also, we cannot forget Ziyarat Ashura. For whatever reason, this does seem to have a position before Allah Ta'ala. I think there's too many people who have sought Allah's mercy through reciting this, especially people who commit to doing it for 40 days and see a response after the 40 days, for example on the 41st day, for this to be coincidence. And even in my own life I've seen it as well. In fact, I even had a friend once, she made a pledge to Allah Ta'ala to recite Ziyarat Ashura for 40 days, and then, being human, she forgot after a while. So she read it for a few days, she forgot, but nonetheless her prayer was answered again after the end of the 40 days.
Wow.
And that's even more effective, according to many ulama, and I believe it's also true, if you pledge to do it in the full form, with the full 100 times, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah, and so on. Not that, I think it's important not to get into the magic spell mode. It's not that we recite the words and we expect we're going to work some sort of magic, but it conveys before Allah Ta'ala some sort of sincerity and trust in Him if we are actually willing to invest that much of our energy and effort into doing something. And of course, the position of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam before Allah Ta'ala is, extremely, indescribably high. So definitely asking for Allah's mercy and blessings through someone like Imam al-Hussein, alayhi salam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and so forth, inshallah, is one of the best ways to really invoke his mercy and his aid. We cannot forget too that we have an Imam. Imam Zaman, may Allah hasten his return. He cares about what happens to us. He is responsible for us. If you have people who you are responsible for and you're an even moderately nice person, whether they're family, friends, students, if you have employees, whoever it happens to be, if you're just even a moderately decent person and one of them's going through a difficulty that you can help with, you're going to help them out, right? Because that's just the humane, decent thing to do. And of course the Imam is ma'soom, and he does deeply care about people, especially those who elect to follow him, and we say we want to be his followers, but we are in distress and in need. Again, I don't think it ever fails to reach out to the Imam of our time, and we find responses in sometimes very unexpected ways. With respect to ourselves, in addition to prayer, on a very practical level, because again, I do think it's important to combine the spiritual with the practical in a subject like this, I did read some good advice from a psychologist once. Now, I'm not saying 100% the advice is true or the research is true, but I thought this was a good point. So I'm going to mention it, inshallah. And that is, they're examining people who dealt with crises, and those people who tended towards falling into depression and other issues, versus those who tended to flourish in difficulties. And the deciding factor between these two groups of people, they found, was that people who tended to respond by becoming depressed or having other psychological issues when faced with life crises were the type of people who, when something difficult happened, they basically directed their energy inwards and tried to change themselves. So for example, let's say, I don't want to start listing crises. Let's say something very difficult happens, and you try to focus on yourself. So I need to become more patient, I need to be more tolerant, I need to endure this, and you direct your energy inward. They said these are the people who are not likely to flourish in these situations. Whereas people who had more of a problem-solving mentality, okay, I'm in this situation, what can I practically do to change the situation, to affect the people in the situation, to change the world around me, we're much more likely to do well. Now, of course, we don't always, sometimes our options are limited. And also there's a wisdom in doing both. Sometimes it helps to change our outlook, and sometimes it helps to change our situation. But that's something I've given a lot of thought to since I've read it, because I do think there's a lot of truth to that. And so again, it's about avoiding that victim mentality by reminding ourselves that yes, everything happens with the permission of Allah. Yes, Allah Ta'ala does try the believers, and He will, inshallah, try us if we are believers, while at the same time not letting go of that self-responsibility and saying, well, Allah wants us to act too. He doesn't just want us to be doormats. And of course, the believer is optimistic, according to narrations. The believer always has hope in Allah Ta'ala, and as is narrated, Allah is shy to disappoint the hopes of His servants.
Ahsan, I think that's a fitting and shy to disappoint His servants. Beautiful ending there. Inshallah, we can take these pieces of advice, this I think very useful, this psychological tip as well, the idea of trying to change our surroundings. Of course, we can't avoid these trials and tribulations, they will come. It's just a matter of looking at things positively and trying to take the du'as and the ziyarats that have been provided for us. And inshallah we can face these things successfully. Join us again next week on The Struggle Within. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ahlul Bayt TV, the holy household for every household.